Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. You guys sent in a really interesting article this time. It's Mary Louise Arnold's Stage, Sequence, and Sequels, Changing Conceptions of Morality Post-Kohlberg.
Yes. A classic.
It is. And it really gets us thinking. We're going to really try and get to the heart of this today and figure out, like, how have our ideas about what makes a good person, a moral person, changed since Lawrence Kohlberg did his, super important work?
Right.
And what does all of that tell us about how important it is to actually think clearly when we are figuring out what's right and wrong in our lives?
Yeah, I think that's really the core question here, isn't it? I mean, Kohlberg's stage and sequence theory, everyone knows it.
Right.
And it was hugely influential for, gosh, probably 30 years.
Yeah.
After he put it out there, it just dominated how people thought about moral development and morality itself.
Mm.
But as you said, it also sparked a ton of debate.
A lot of controversy.
And it's interesting because since Kohlberg passed away, this is what Arnold points out, the field has moved into what she calls a pivotal stage, where people are asking new questions and really coming up with some pretty exciting new directions for research.
Yeah, it's cool to see how it's evolved.
It is.
So for this deep dive, what we want to do is really dig into these sequels to Kohlberg's theory, as Arnold calls them, explore all these new ways of thinking about what it means to be a moral person, a good person, and super importantly, what these new ideas tell us about the role of, like, logic and reason in our understanding of morality itself. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, I think it's a good roadmap. So I guess to start, we need to go back to the beginning and lay out Kohlberg's original framework.
Yeah, definitely. Let's break it down. So where did he even start?
Well, reason was absolutely central to Kohlberg's whole cognitive developmental approach. He really saw moral judgment as the most important thing, maybe even the only thing that determined whether someone would act morally.
So it wasn't about the action itself so much as, like, the thought process behind it.
That's it. He was hugely influenced by thinkers like Kant and really believed that for an action to be genuinely moral, it had to be rational, it had to be driven by a purpose, clear intentions, and it had to be freely chosen, which,
That's a high bar.
it is a pretty tough standard to meet.
Yeah.
And he was also building on the work of Piaget and Baldwin, who were real pioneers in understanding how kids kind of actively build their understanding of the world.
Right.
And Kohlberg basically applied that to morality.
Mm.
So he believed that people actively build their own understanding of what's right and wrong. It's not just given to you.
You have to figure it out.
Yeah. And this understanding unfolds in stages, so it gets more complex over time. That's his famous six-stage theory, right? And it outlines how our grasp of things like justice and rights gets more sophisticated as we develop.
So his idea was, as your ability to reason through these moral problems got better, you basically became a more moral person.
Yeah, that's the core idea.
Yeah.
He thought these later stages would lead to better solutions because they were based on these more just principles.
Okay.
And he even believed that just understanding these principles, just getting to those higher levels, was motivating in itself.
So if you recognize an injustice, it would kind of push you to act in a more just way. You wouldn't even have to think about it.
Exactly. That's a super important point.
Yeah.
He really thought reason had this power, this inherent power to make people act according to their judgments.
Okay.
Now, later on, he did acknowledge that the connection between what stage you were at,
Right.
how sophisticated your reasoning was, and your actual behavior, what you actually did,
Right.
was a bit more complex than he initially thought.
Of course, yeah.
He started thinking about ideas like what we say is the right thing to do versus what we actually feel personally responsible for.
Interesting.
But even with all those changes, he still really believed that the underlying logic of your thinking, your reasoning, was the most influential factor in how you would act.
Okay, so reason was the core foundation.
Absolutely. It was the bedrock of moral maturity for Kohlberg.
Okay. But we kind of touched on this earlier. Like, his theory was not without its critics. What were some of the main criticisms leveled against his focus on reason, on thinking?
Well, one of the biggest ones, and this came up over and over again, was that he gave reason way too much power and didn't really account for all these other crucial parts of our moral lives, like our emotions, our character, our habits.
Right.
Yeah,
It's hard to imagine making any moral decision without feeling anything, right?
absolutely, like empathy or guilt.
Or anger.
Yeah, exactly. All of those seem pretty central to morality. And critics also said there wasn't a lot of strong evidence showing exactly how reason interacted with all these other things.
Right.
And maybe even more importantly, how it actually led to moral behavior in the real world,
Mm.
not just hypothetical situation.
Right, the gap between knowing and doing.
Exactly. And then you had this whole debate about whether his stages were really universal.
Oh,
The culturalists argue that his stages didn't really apply or make sense in societies with different customs and values.
right.
And the particularists, uh, they argue that his stages were too abstract, too removed from the day-to-day situations where people actually make moral choices.
Yeah, so the assumption that moral development in, say, Western cultures, individualistic cultures, was the same everywhere else.
Right.
It wasn't really a given.
Yeah, there are also challenges to that. And then you had the feminist critiques,
Yeah.
probably most famously Carol Gilligan.
Yeah, right.
She argued that Kohlberg overemphasized justice reasoning,
Yeah.
the rules and individual rights. And he didn't really consider a care and response orientation, which she said was more important, especially for women. So, justice reasoning is about following the rules, being fair, and care and response is more about taking care of relationships and people's needs.
Okay, so that's a good way to break it down.
Mm.
Justice reasoning rules and care and response needs and relationships.
Exactly. And that really started a whole new discussion about different ways of approaching ethics and morality.
Yeah, totally different frameworks.
And beyond those big theoretical arguments,
Yeah.
you also had these methodological concerns. People questioned how realistic his moral dilemmas were. There were all these hypothetical situations that felt pretty far removed from the messy realities of everyday life.
Right, they felt kind of artificial.
Yeah. People also had doubts about his moral judgment interview and the scoring system, even after all the revisions he did. There were questions about whether his stages were truly developmental. Did they really show a progression?
Right.
And were the differences between the highest, the post-conventional stages, even clear or meaningful? Like, how do we even measure morality, and are we measuring the right things?
Yeah, that's a huge question.
It is. But maybe one of the most interesting criticisms, the one that really sums up a lot of these worries, was the kind of moral person that Kohlberg's theory seemed to portray. Critics argued that his whole emphasis on reason painted this picture of a really cold, overly rational, detached person, even at the highest stages of development.
So you could be at the peak of moral reasoning, but still not be a particularly good person.
Right. Arnold even mentions that subtitle, or How to Reach Stage 6 and Remain a Bastard.
Yeah, I love that. It's provocative. It really gets you thinking.
It does. It gets to the heart of the problem. It's like, okay, Kohlberg made huge contributions, but we need a more complete picture here. It's not just about thinking about moral problems. It's about living a moral life. As Walker and his colleagues put it, there's this particular skew in the field that's kind of preventing us from really understanding morality.
Interesting. So it's time to shift the focus.
Yeah.
So with all these criticisms in mind, what are some of the main sequels to Kohlberg's theory? What are some of the new themes popping up in moral psychology? Where did the field go?
Well, Arnold talks about this strong revisionist spirit in the field, with people doing all these bold and daring things, new initiatives.
So shaking things up a bit.
Yeah, trying new things. And I think the big goal now is to build a more complete theory that goes beyond just moral judgment. It's really looking at how morality works in the real world.
Right, moving from thought to action.
Exactly. And one of the big things is this rethinking of what even counts as morality. Like, where do we draw the line?
Okay.
For example, Turiel, he's done a lot of work on separating morality from social conventions and personal choices.
So it's not just about what society tells us is right or wrong.
Right. There's something deeper there. Like, chewing with your mouth open might be bad manners, but hurting someone is a whole different category.
Okay, that makes sense. Different categories.
Different categories. And then Schwitter has talked about how different cultures actually have different ideas about what's morally important. He's identified these three big categories: autonomy, community, and divinity.
Oh, interesting. So different cultures have different focuses.
Yeah. So a culture focused on community, you might see a greater emphasis on things like loyalty and group harmony, even if that clashes with individual freedom, you know.
Yeah, I see.
So it really challenges this idea that Western individualistic views are universal.
It's a broader view of morality.
It is, and it goes beyond just justice.
Yeah.
We've got Gilligan's focus on care, and then even ideas like filial piety,
Right.
And people are looking more closely at social factors and trying to understand the perspectives of regular people. The goal is to get a more complete picture of morality in all its diversity.
A more inclusive view.
Exactly. And another big theme is this focus on the details of everyday life, like how our social context actually shapes our moral behavior.
Okay.
And this is where you have researchers like Killen and Hart, Hellwig, Snary, and Eunice and Yates.
Yeah.
And studies have shown that the specific situation you're in can actually affect how consistently you make moral judgments, which challenges Kohlberg's idea of a stable system of reasoning.
So it's not just about your internal stage, it's about the situation too.
Yeah, like your moral reasoning might look different when you're dealing with a good friend versus a stranger, or if it's a personal issue versus a societal one.
Right, that makes sense.
And this has led to all these new measures of moral judgment in different contexts, even new programs designed for specific groups, like kids who are struggling with antisocial behavior.
Oh, okay. So more practical, real-world applications.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, people are using all sorts of new research methods. Tappan, for example, has been a big advocate for what he calls a discursive turn.
Okay.
That's about using people's stories and narratives to understand the moral person, not just their scores on a test.
Right.
And Colby and Damon have gone back to this idea of assisted autobiography, where they really dive deep into the lives of people who are committed to moral action.
So a shift from abstract thinking to looking at how people actually live their lives.
Exactly.
And that brings up this question of how we even define a moral person.
Right. So we've shifted away from purely rational judgment. What does that mean for the person making those judgments?
Yeah, that's the key question.
It is. Moral psychology has always been interested in the moral agent, but Kohlberg's focus on reason kind of left the agent in the shadows a bit.
Right.
Now, we're realizing that this picture was a bit thin. Like Walker and his colleagues said, it was kind of an impoverished description of the moral agent.
Right.
We need a more complete picture.
Okay, so how do we get there? What are some of the theories that have emerged to help us get a clearer picture of the moral person?
Well, there are a few key thinkers who really set the stage for this. Rest, in his model of moral development, really emphasized this idea of seeing yourself as a moral person,
Yeah.
having a self-identity as a moral being. He thought that was a really important motivator for people to actually prioritize moral values.
Okay, so your sense of self matters.
Yeah. And Davidson and Eunice really highlighted how your social world shapes your moral thinking and your sense of identity.
Right. So it's not just what's going on in your head, it's about how you see yourself in the world.
Exactly. And Blasi, I think he provides the most complete account here. He said that your sense of self is the missing piece in Kohlberg's theory when it comes to actually acting morally. He called it a self-model of morality.
Okay.
He said it's this need to be consistent with yourself, to act in ways that line up with your beliefs that creates that feeling of obligation. You have to do the right thing because it's tied to who you believe you are.
You're not just thinking about it, you're feeling it.
Exactly. And Blasi said that reason alone can't create that. It's about how much your moral beliefs are integrated into your whole personality.
Okay.
He said the influence of our moral beliefs depends on how personally important we see them. So it's not just knowing what's right. It's about building your whole sense of self around those beliefs.
That's interesting. So what does all of this look like in real life? What are these moral individuals actually like?
Well, there's been a lot of research on this, especially on what's called moral excellence, looking at people who are known for their strong moral commitments. Colby and Damon, for example, did this fascinating study of 23 people like this who were just, really committed to moral action in their lives.
Okay.
And what they found was that the most striking thing, despite their different backgrounds, was how seamlessly they integrated their moral vision with their personal goals and their sense of who they were.
They were all on the same page internally.
Yeah, like it was all connected for them. And what's really interesting is that their moral reasoning, according to Kohlberg's stages, actually varied quite a bit from stage 3 to 5.
Really? I would have thought they'd all be at the highest stages.
Right. But Colby and Damon concluded that it wasn't so much about what stage they were at, but whether their goals and sense of self really supported their commitment to morality.
Okay.
And they even suggested that these exemplars might just be more extreme versions of a potential that we all have.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. It's like we all have the capacity for this kind of moral commitment. And then Hart and Fagley looked at teenagers who were known for being altruistic,
Okay.
and they found something similar. These kids had really strong connections between how they saw themselves and their actions, and they used more moral terms to describe themselves.
Right.
But again, their moral judgment wasn't that different from other teenagers. So it seems like this pattern might hold up across different ages.
It's not just about being smart, it's about who you are.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
Okay.
Eunice and Yates have also done a lot of work on how kids develop moral and civic identities through things like volunteering. And their work kind of points in the same direction.
Right. So maybe it's less about abstract moral reasoning and more about the lived experience of morality,
Yeah.
how it becomes part of who you are.
All right. And then there's this whole area of research looking at people's subjective conceptions of morality, how individuals actually experience and understand it in their daily lives. Arnold did this study where she looked at teenagers' ideas about personal virtue, what they considered virtuous.
Yeah.
And she found that the kids who had a stronger sense of moral self were more likely to actually behave in positive ways, according to their teachers.
Okay.
But their scores on moral judgment tests didn't really predict that.
So what kind of moral person you want to be might be more important than how well you can reason through a moral problem.
Yeah, I think that's the takeaway.
Interesting.
And Walker and his colleagues have done a lot of research on how people naturally think about morality across their whole lives.
Okay.
And what they've found is that, when people talk about real moral conflicts in their lives, they're often focused on personal relationships and those internal struggles.
Right.
It's not just about abstract justice.
Okay.
And they often rely on intuition, conscience, their gut feeling. They talk about their personal feelings, practical concerns, even their faith. And when they're describing people they consider really moral, they focus on their character compassion, carrying their actions, not their moral reasoning.
So it seems like in our everyday lives, our decisions might be driven more by our instincts, by who we are, than by careful, rational analysis.
Yeah, that's what the research seems to suggest.
Okay, so with all of this in mind, how does this change our understanding of the role of reason, especially compared to Kohlberg's ideas?
Well, this new research definitely challenges that central role that Kohlberg gave to reason, especially, the stage-based model as the way to measure how morally mature someone is.
Okay.
And this brings up a couple of big sets of questions. The first is psychological. Does this research mean that reason isn't actually that important for moral behavior? Like, what's the place of moral reasoning now?
Right.
And then you have this methodological question. Is psychology still focused on understanding people's reasoning?
Okay.
Like, are we questioning Kohlberg's whole way of studying morality?
So does how we think still matter?
Right. And it seems like the research we've talked about doesn't really back up the idea that moving through Kohlberg's stages is the most important thing for being a moral person.
Right, because we saw that moral stage wasn't really linked to how people acted.
Yeah.
But their sense of moral identity, who they saw themselves as morally, was.
Exactly. And now we have to acknowledge that the connection between judgment and action, what you think and what you do, is super complex.
Yeah.
Blasey and others have really dug into this.
Yeah.
And just because we don't see a strong link between moral stage and behavior in these studies doesn't mean that judgment is irrelevant.
Right, so it's more nuanced than that.
It is.
Yeah.
And it makes us ask, when is that sophisticated reasoning necessary? When does stage-based reasoning really matter for being a moral person?
Right.
And I think two things are really important here. The first is the type of problem. A complicated ethical dilemma might require more thought than just helping someone in need. And then there's the individual, the person. People approach things differently. They have different moral personalities, as Flanagan calls it.
Different styles.
Yeah. Like you think about Colby and Damon's examples. Some of those exemplars were really driven by justice, by reasoning it all out.
Right.
Others were more focused on empathy and relieving suffering. Both are valid expressions of moral maturity, so maybe there isn't one right way to be a moral person.
Yeah.
Which makes us wonder, should we even be using this stage concept? Maybe we need a different way to understand moral development.
Fully different framework.
Yeah, potentially. REST, for example, talks about these cognitive schemas, which are these more flexible ways of organizing moral information. And that might be a better fit, although it would be a big shift from Kohlberg.
Yeah.
But there's also a less rigid way to interpret Kohlberg, and that's to see reason as this idea of making meaning, figuring out your place in the world. And this new research, with its focus on in-depth interviews, actually fits in with that really well. They're trying to understand the person's own perspective on their moral experiences.
Even those gut reactions.
Even those. Yeah. It's not just a random feeling. There's a process of meaning-making going on there.
Right.
And fundamentally, Kohlberg believed We're studying morality when someone has reasons for what they do, there's a purpose, an intention, and now Walker finds that people rely on these gut reactions. It's really interesting.
It is.
Does that count as morality? What happens to rationality as the core of morality?
What even triggers those gut reactions?
Right. Is it just not being able to think clearly? Or is it something deeper? Some deeply ingrained moral beliefs that have become automatic? These are the questions we need to explore.
So what are we left with here? It sounds like we're moving beyond Kohlberg. We're painting a much richer picture of what it means to be a moral person.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And while moral judgment is still important, the connection to behavior is way more complex.
It's not as straightforward as we thought.
No. And how integrated those moral values are in our sense of self might be even more important.
So it's not just about knowing what's right, but about being the kind of person who cares about doing what's right.
Exactly.
That's pretty profound.
It is. And it leaves us with this question. What does it really mean to be a moral person in your own life? How do you balance reason and emotion? What role does your sense of self play in all of this?
It's something to think about as you navigate your own decisions.